Lord of the Mysteries Audiobook, Part 105.
Chapter 1041, King's Daughter. Sharon, who doesn't like nicknames. How did she know? She's interacted with Miss Sharon before? Upon hearing Reinette Tinker's answer, Klein was first taken aback before questions emerged one after another in his mind. From his point of view, a messenger and a mailer wouldn't communicate under normal circumstances. The entire process would be the messenger's appearance, the retrieval of the letter, and its departure. Besides, when did Miss Messenger need to obtain the permission of the other party when she gives nicknames? Did Frank Lee and Patrick Bryan agree to it? A few seconds later, Klein instinctively had a guess. Miss Messenger and Miss Sharon definitely had some kind of connection, and Reinette Tinker didn't wish to hide anything. Reining in his thoughts, Klein opened the envelope, unfolded the letter, and quickly scanned the contents. "There's something I hope you can help me with. Let's meet at the Bravehearts bar to discuss in detail." Compared to before, Miss Sharon isn't that stingy with her words. She's slightly improved in this aspect for the better. Is this a change that resulted from a demigod advancement? Klein thought for a moment and walked to his desk. Picking up a pen, he wrote, "When do you wish to meet?" Putting down his pen, he glanced at Reinette Tinker, who was standing by the side, seemingly waiting to write the reply. Klein felt even more certain again. He folded the letter, handed it over, and casually said, "For Miss Sharon." One of Reinette Tinker's heads bit on the letter while the remaining three said, "You haven't paid." "No. Postage. Payment." Klein cleared his throat, took out a gold coin, and handed it to Miss Messenger. Seeing Reinette Tinker disappear, he revealed a pensive look as he walked to the reclining chair and waited patiently. Less than a minute later, Miss Messenger walked out of the void again in her complicated dress. She was biting the letter from before. Klein didn't inquire as he received the reply letter and unfolded it. "If you don't have any problems with it, it would be best if it happens tonight." "Tonight?" Klein nodded thoughtfully and flicked his wrist, causing the letter to ignite into scarlet flames, quickly turning it black. The flame burgeoned and enveloped his body as well. By the time the flames extinguished, Klein's figure had already disappeared from the reclining chair. The floating ashes hovering in midair automatically fell into a nearby trash can with the help of an invisible wind. In the houses that were connected together in Backlund's North Borough, Sherwood Borough, and the bridge area, the wall gas lamps brightened slightly before returning to normal. Before long, Klein appeared in a room he had privately rented at the periphery of East Borough. He changed his clothes, put on gold-rimmed glasses, and went out with the appearance of Sherlock Moriarty, heading straight for the Bravehearts bar. This time, he didn't seek out Ian, who was in the card room playing tabletop games with a bunch of people. He listened for a few seconds before pushing open the door to one of the billiard rooms and entered slowly. Just as he flipped open the door, he saw figures outlining themselves on two sides. Sitting on a high stool to the left was the blonde, blue-eyed Sharon. She was wearing an exquisite bonnet and a regal dress. Compared to the past, her face was no longer as pale as before. It just looked like she was anemic, making her look less like a female ghost and more like a doll. Standing to the right of the billiard table was Marie. This young man who liked to play cards with zombies had turned increasingly pale. The malice in his eyes had become unobvious, but it gave a suppressive feeling to others. "Good evening." Klein took off his hat with a smile and bowed. "Good evening, Mr. Detective." Sharon's body seemed to float up weightlessly as she seriously bowed. Marie did the same. At that moment, the billiard room seemed to be filled with paranormal events. Klein casually pulled a high stool chair and sat down. He chuckled and said, "What is it this time?" "I'm very sorry to trouble you again." Sharon bowed again. Marie quickly said, "We made an agreement for a cooperative effort with the Sanguine to deal with the key members of the Rose School of Thought in Backlund. We will definitely carry out the bulk of it ourselves. It will include how we lure them out, how we ambush them, and how our attack will happen. We just hope that you will watch the entire process by the side and aid in our escape when an accident happens. If you want anything, just mention it. We can discuss it. That is to say, I'm a contingency to prevent any accidents. What if that fellow, Emlyn, also enlists the world to secretly help? When that happens, they would have 2 demigods in their contingency plans. I think it might work. I can be Sherlock Moriarty while letting Conas Kilgore be Gehrman Sparrow. Klein considered for a few seconds without immediately agreeing. Instead, he said, let me ask a few questions. Marie glanced at Sharon and nodded. Okay. Klein looked at Sharon, who was sitting on a high stool like a doll. The Tutensis mummy we previously obtained was a preparation for you to advance to Sequence 4 puppet, and you've already become a demigod? This was something he had previously learned from their conversations and letter exchanges. His main goal was to make a confirmation and start the subsequent topic. Sharon quietly looked back at him as she said with an ethereal and inhuman voice, yes. Klein nodded slightly and directly asked, what's your relationship with Reinette Tinker? Sharon's blue eyes darted about almost indissemblably as she said, she is my teacher. Teacher. She. Although Klein already had some guesses, he nearly drew a gasp. He felt his head aching. In the blink of an eye, although his expression remained the same, countless thoughts were bubbling in his mind. Miss Messenger was originally an angel? I'm actually using an angel as a messenger? Isn't that too exaggerated? She is even Miss Sharon's teacher. It probably wasn't that simple when she requested to be my messenger. From the looks of it, she definitely isn't on the same side as the Mother Tree of Desire. Miss Messenger signed the contract with me because the Mother Tree of Desire was coveting me? No, that she is bound to be my enemy? It's no wonder Miss Sharon was able to obtain the puppet potion formula and the corresponding ingredients with the help of her teacher. As his thoughts raced, Klein decided to ask another question. He wanted to use the process of Miss Sharon's or Marie's replies to calm his emotions. He deliberated and said, what's the exact situation? This time, it was still Sharon replying. Compared to Hormic's mechanical dolls, she appeared more lifeless as she calmly said, early in the 5th epoch, death perished. There was resistance stirring against the Balam Empire in places like the southern continent's Star Highlands and Paz Valley. During this process, the Chained God appeared, and the Rose School of Thought was born. My teacher was originally the daughter of the ruler of the local highlands, but she later became the blessed of the Chained God, assisting her father in establishing the Highlands Kingdom. Later on, she became a Sequence 2 angel, one of the leaders of the Rose School of Thought. She advocated temperance and using austere and few desires to resist the madness in life. About 922 years ago, the Son of God, Sua, was born. Everything began to change as the indulgence and bloody rituals gradually took over the dominating faction. At first, Teacher was barely able to maintain it, preventing the temperance faction from being affected. However, as time passed, the influence of the Mother Tree of Desire grew. Sua also successfully advanced a few years ago, becoming a true abomination. An internal war broke out. Teacher protected us as we escaped from the highlands, valley, and grasslands. I watched her fall under the siege of Sua and the other high-ranking members. However, she didn't completely die because of prior preparations. She resurrected in a special state in the spirit world and now yearns to complete her body. Is that so? In other words, Miss Messenger is currently, in essence, an angel without the corresponding powers. She is in a weakened state. It's no wonder she wasn't able to easily deal with the Rose School of Thought demigod, Shanks. Wait, although there are many angels cooperating with me, why are they all incomplete or weak? Apart from Ma'am Ariana, all of them are in such states. Mr. Azek, Pallas Zorost, Will Oseptin, Miss Messenger. Is there a problem with my title as the Fool? Are they all waiting for me to give them the charms corresponding to Scholar of Yore? Klein came to a realization as he felt rather poignant. He didn't ask why Reinette Tinker still desired money, as he thought for a moment before saying, Miss Sharon, the Rose School of Thought definitely has no lack of the puppet potion formula. After you obtain the Tutmosis mummy, they would likely view you as a demigod. In addition, Mamrionette Tinker had once appeared before the Rose School of Thought's demigod and engaged in a battle with them. This also means that the Rose School of Thought definitely knows that she is alive, and they would not be prepared against her. And your relationship as master and disciple with her is no secret to them. In such a situation, isn't it a little too naive to use yourself and Marie as bait to fish out the key members of the Rose School of Thought in Backlund? Do you think they will only send 1 or 2 demigods to deal with you? Up to what degree of help can the Sanguine provide? Also, I previously mentioned that due to one of my identities, the Mother Tree of Desire places a great deal of importance on me. Even Abomination Sua was sent to attack me. And your teacher's cooperation with me is something they are similarly aware of. Summarizing all these points, if you and Marie appear, the kind of assault you would invite is unpredictable. Having said that, Klein's expression turned serious as he asked, "Do you wish to cause a divine descent in Backlund?" The entire billiard room instantly turned abnormally quiet, but there weren't any changes to Sharon's expression. Chapter 1042, Plan from a Different Angle. After a few seconds, Sharon calmly replied to Klein, "It's not bait, but a ploy to lure them out." Just as Klein was about to ask what the difference was, Merrick explained in detail, "Back when we were pursued by the Rose School of Thought, we discovered that they had quite a number of members in Backlund. However, due to our lack of strength and our fear of traps, as well as to not attract the attention of the church, we didn't take any action against them. This time, we plan on attacking one of the more important ones. We'll deliberately miss some out, allowing the hidden ones to secretly escape and pass the information to the Rose School of Thought's person in charge in Backlund. In secret, the Sanguine's demigod will be watching them. Through the message chain, they will find the person in charge. That person must be a key member of the Rose School of Thought. Once he's killed or even captured, we'll take the next step in our operation based on the information we manage to obtain. That's more reasonable. The main point is to use your own understanding of the Rose School of Thought to create a plan instead of using yourself as bait. That's a way to effectively control the situation and not destroy Backlund." Klein nodded gently and said, "If that's the case, I can participate." He didn't say that he needed to think about it or return to confirm the level of danger. This was because this matter wasn't something that needed to be done anytime soon for Sharon and the Sanguine. When he divined problems, he could always call it off as a participant. "What kind of payment do you need?" Merrick's standing posture relaxed as he asked. Klein smiled. "If there aren't any accidents the entire time, I wish to receive 1 instance of free assistance from Mamrionette Tinker. If I have to involve myself in the operation, I can always add the condition of having priority on the spoils of war. You can discuss this with Mamrionette Tinker before writing to tell me the answer." In fact, he was still a little puzzled. He believed that with such a plan, there was no need to seek him out. With Miss Messenger hiding in the shadows, it was enough to prevent any accidents that Sherlock Moriarty could deal with. There's no need. Sharon, with her exquisite looks and pale face, shook her head gently like a doll. "I can agree to it now." "Has she already discussed it with Miss Messenger?" Klein thought for a few seconds and honestly asked, "Then why don't you directly ask Miss Reinette Tinker for help to prevent any accidents from happening?" Sharon's hair remained motionless as though bound tightly by the petite bonnet. She replied in an ethereal and fleeting voice, "She doesn't wish for the Sanguine to discover her existence." "Is that so?" Klein deliberated for a moment and raised another question. "You advocate temperance, so why are you seeking out the key members of the Rose School of Thought? Is revenge not within the limits of temperance?" Sharon looked at him with her blue eyes and said, "In recent decades, the Rose School of Thought has been trying its best to let the Mother Tree of Desire descend into the real world. This will bring about an unimaginable disaster. In addition, Teacher also desires her body to be complete. If the Mother Tree of Desire were to descend into the real world, it would be an unimaginable disaster for me. However, what has this got to do with the completeness of Miss Messenger's body? Her body was once torn apart and is being held by different key members of the Rose School of Thought." Or can the body's high-sequence beyonders of the same sequence and their characteristics be made into a part of her through some ritual? Klein mumbled inwardly as he probed, is Abomination Sequence 1 of the mutant pathway? Then what are Sequence 2 and Sequence 3? He had asked Miss Sharon the first question before, but he had only received a vague answer. Sharon answered without any hesitation. She didn't speak too fast, but her voice remained ethereal and inhuman. I wasn't too sure about it in the past. Now I can confirm that Sequence 1 is Abomination, Sequence 2 is Ancient Bane, Sequence 3 is Cursed Artifact but is now known as Disciple of Silence. Does that mean that you weren't certain when I asked you the last time? That is to say, when you summoned Miss Messenger and reunited with her, you managed to learn more secrets? Klein nodded in enlightenment. I have no more questions. After confirming the time for the operation, write to me. Thank you. Sharon once again floated up and bowed. Merrick pressed his hand to his chest and slightly bent his back. There's no need. Klein stood up from the high stool and wore his top hat with a smile. This time, without a smacking sound, scarlet flames rose and engulfed him. Under the night sky, countless lights silently lit up in Backland, as though they were stars that were covered in clouds descending upon the land. With the few stars twinkling, Klein returned to the rental apartment at the periphery of East Borough. After changing his clothes and preparing to return to North Borough's Buckland Street, he heard a series of illusory pleas. It was from a man. After nodding in thought, Klein immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived above the gray fog. He extended his spirituality towards the constantly expanding and shrinking crimson star. As he expected, this corresponded to the moon Emlyn. The vampire who was already become a viscount prayed sincerely, Honorable Mr. Fool, I wish to apply for a mini-gathering that includes me, Mr. Hanged Man, Ma'am Hermit, Miss Justice, Mr. World. To Emlyn, these people are the Tarot Club's representatives in intelligence, experience, and knowledge. Poor Leonard. Klein chuckled silently as he leaned back into his chair and agreed to Emlyn's request. Above the grayish-white fog, inside the ancient palace, 5 dark red beams of light appeared on both sides of the long bronze table, forming different figures. Mr. Moon, has the Sangwon's plan been finalized? Audrey greeted everyone before asking with interest. Emlyn surveyed the area and frankly said, yes, the detailed plan is this. Through 2 Temperance faction members who escaped from the Rose School of Thought. He recounted the plan Sharon had described to Sherlock Moriarty from a different angle to the world Gehrman Sparrow and Company. When he was done, he said, if we can obtain effective information, we Sangwon plan on seizing the opportunity to launch a surprise attack on the Rose School of Thought's headquarters. We hope to take an important item from them. What important item? Catalia asked curiously. This was an item that could spur an ancient faction into an attempt on attacking a secret organization's headquarters. It definitely wasn't simple. Its importance might even exceed that of an ordinary angel, stronger than some Grade 0 sealed artifacts. Emlyn didn't hide anything. It's a holy artifact left behind by our Sangwon ancestor. I'm not sure what particular accident led to the Rose School of Thought obtaining it. A holy artifact left behind by Lilith. In the hands of the Rose School of Thought. The Sangwon has placed great importance on it. This time, Klein, who was acting as the world Gehrman Sparrow with his true body, had key points flashing through his mind. Then, together with his understanding of many secrets, he quickly had an unconfirmed theory. That might be the key to the Mother Tree of Desire's ability to intrude and control part of the Moon Domain's authority. This is something Miss Sharon and the others didn't mention. The Sangwon have kept things from them as well and have quite great ambitions. Yes, I can't use ambition to describe them. That ancestor Lilith whose identity is unknown seems to have foreseen the chaos from the situation and the coming of the apocalypse. Therefore, the Sangwon was made to change its style and become more proactive, so as to have more things to rely on. This is the acquisition of a life buoy in preparation for the apocalypse. Klein didn't say a word as he listened silently. The others were also taking in the important information that the moon had revealed, and Alger was no exception. He pondered for a few seconds before saying, in other words, You Sanguine will be hiding in secret this entire operation and won't be targeted by the Rose School of Thought? Yes, Emlyn answered rather casually. The Sanguine's plan was jointly decided by Duke Ulmer and Marquis Nibs, as well as a few earls in Backland. Many problems had undoubtedly been brainstormed and reconsidered. Regardless, even if a pig were to live for more than a millennium, it would definitely gain a certain level of wisdom and experience. Alger nodded slightly. I have another question. How are you so sure that the Backland person in charge of the Rose School of Thought is only a saint? There might be more demigods or even an angel hiding. You should know very well that the situation in Backland is very complicated. It's not impossible for the Rose School of Thought to increase the number of powerhouses it has to plot certain matters. If that's the case, you will end up resembling thieves who wish to steal something, only to storm right into Civilau's yard. Civilau's yard was another name for the Backland Police Department. Emlyn became more relaxed. This time, Duke Ulmer will personally watch over the entire process. Even if the Rose School of Thought's angel descends, we can easily escape. In addition, no matter which side, they're not actually willing to create an intense conflict in Backland. Without any crushing advantage or the confidence to not cause a huge commotion, they will naturally cease any fighting. Upon hearing his answer, the corners of Catalia's mouth curled up indiscernibly as she warned, to Beyonders who aren't demigods, even a slight clash between angels would produce aftershocks that are enough to destroy them. Emlyn snapped out of his state of drowning in pride from experiencing the potency of the Sanguine. He was momentarily at a loss for words. At this moment, Audrey's eyes darted around as though she was thinking of something. Mr. Moon, what do you need to do in this plan? What do I need to do? Monitoring the secret members of the Rose School of Thought and locking onto the true target from the information received will be done by Earl Mistral. The one who will ultimately take action is Marquis Nibs, Earl Mistral, and the Rose School of Thought Temperance faction's demigod. Duke Ulmer will be the one monitoring in secret to prevent any accidents. My only job is apparently to contact that wraith named Merrick and maintain communications between both parties. The more Emlyn thought about it, the odder his expression became. It seemed like there was nothing for him to do, or at least, nothing particularly important. Chapter 1043, each having their own plans. Emlyn blinked as he leaned back in his chair. He spoke unhurriedly and with a hint of a smile, he answered Miss Justice's question. What I need to do is very simple. My role is to ensure that both parties can complete the collaboration successfully. That means you don't need to participate in the battle, right? Audrey had originally wanted to press with such questions, but after sizing up the moon, she reflected on the words said and said with a faint smile, since that's the case, there's only one thing you need to do to ensure your own safety. Makes sense. I can't affect myself because of this matter. Anyway, there's nothing that needs my assistance. I'm not in charge of the risky parts of the operation. I'll later rent Lamino's travels and spend money to get the world to record a few pages of teleport. My safety will basically be guaranteed. Emlyn thought for a few seconds and said with a nod, excellent suggestion. As there were no other members of the Tarot Club participating in the Sanguine's hunting operation and wasn't under their control, the private men gathering quickly ended and the participants returned to the real world. Klein wasn't in a rush to leave. After his figure disappeared, he appeared in the Fool's Chair again and beckoned for the unshadowed crucifix and the Marauder Pathway mystical item, Broken Finger. At that moment, the surface of the two grayish-white tweezers that resembled the polishing of finger bones had produced a piece of gravel that sucked all the light around it, making it look pitch black. It slowly swirled and gathered as though it was trying to form a new shape. As for Broken Finger, the grayish-white color had turned transparent as it reflected some light, producing tiny holes. The unshadowed crucifix can actually slowly purge the Beyonder characteristics from mystical items and sealed artifacts and let them combine together. Of course, the premise is that there's a power similar to the mysterious space above the gray fog to suppress it, allowing it to willingly make contact with items with Beyonder characteristics. Klein nodded in satisfaction. At this moment, the grayish-white broken finger suddenly began to belt out in a fervent voice, "Oh, my son! Praise you! Praise the sun!" As the tweezer-like object sang, a cracking sound emitted from it as though it would shatter into pieces at any moment. But this did not affect its praise of the sun. Klein gaped at the scene, momentarily at a loss for what expression to show. After a few seconds, he sighed. He separated the unshadowed crucifix and broken finger and threw them to the corner of the junk pile in different spots. He then suppressed the former using the powers of the gray fog. Then, he prepared to leave and return to the real world. At this moment, the point of light, which represented the fool's only believer, emitted ripples of light as the sounds of stacked prayers were heard. Klein reined in his thoughts and extended his spirituality over. Immediately, the scene of Danitz praying in his room surfaced before his eyes as a corresponding voice echoed in his ears. "Honorable Mr. Fool, your faithful servant wishes you to pass the following words to Gehrman Sparrow. According to my captain, there are many items at sea that's rumored to belong to Vice Admiral Aylman, but without any exception, they're all fake. And ever since she was injured after that assault, this pirate admiral has placed great care in the secrecy of her course and seldom plunders. The last time her ship appeared was 2 months ago at Theros Island west of the Berserk Sea. Later, it cruised into the massive ocean, her whereabouts unknown. The foreign object in Anderson's stomach is now controlled to some degree and is separated from his body to a certain extent. It won't be able to penetrate his flesh for a very long period of time. There are 2 ways to completely resolve this latent problem. One is to seek the help of the Sun Pathways Sequence 4 Unshadowed. However, this has quite a high possibility of cleansing most of his beyonder characteristics. The second is to find the Hunter Pathways Sequence 4 Iron-Blooded Night Potion formula. Through the help of the ritual and ingredients, he can directly absorb the foreign object. Anderson is inclined toward the latter choice. He's happy to take the risk. It's obvious that Danitz is forwarding me Vice Admiral Iceberg's answer by imitating her style. This isn't his usual style of speech. However, some of his terms aren't precise enough. Could it be that Danitz had secretly modified it to use terms he understands better? Is he worried that Gehrman Sparrow wouldn't be able to understand? Klein pricked up his brows and cast his attention back onto the content itself. Vice Admiral Aylman adhered to the advice from the Demonist sect and has hidden in this relatively critical period? If that's the case, it's basically impossible to capture her in a short span of time. In 1 or 2 months' time, perhaps the matter will completely blow up and I wouldn't have a need to seek her out. I'll first send Danitz to look for her and keep some hope. My focus will be on finding Demonist Trissy. I have a way to contact her and can consider using the excuse of working together to deal with Saintess of White Katarina to make her meet with Gehrman Sparrow. I'll see if I can control her and use her to fish out Katarina. The elimination of Anderson's latent problem has 2 solutions, both of which I can help with. Since he's inclined toward taking risks by advancing to absorb the foreign object, I don't have to worry about using Danitz to promote the option of leasing the unshadowed crucifix to him. That's good. At least I don't have to worry about the crucifix given by Adam creating some nasty chemical reaction with the foreign object Adam left in him. As for the potion formula for Iron-Blooded Night, with how Anderson had played an important role in luring in Sanguil, it's not like I can't give it to him. The foreign object in his stomach is Adam's payment. I can't directly bestow it to him since he isn't a believer of the Fool. Gehrman Sparrow has no reason to give him something at such a high level. Amidst his thoughts, Klein quickly made a decision. He conjured the world Gehrman Sparrow and made him take on a prayer stance. In the fog sea, on the Golden Dream. Bang! The wooden door was pushed open and slammed heavily into the wall. Amidst this loud commotion, Anderson, who had been flipping the pages of a book, looked at Danitz, who was standing by the door, with his usual expression. "There's a very good mission for you." With a cloak draped over his shoulders, Danitz raised his chin and chuckled. Anderson sized up the pirate opposite him and sked. "You seem to be very smug. What's the mission?" Danitz glanced at Anderson and said, "Accompany me to Theros Island and help me seek out Vice Admiral Aylman's whereabouts." In addition, help me gather the beyonder ingredients needed for Conspirer. Heh, you'll have to pay for it. Anderson nodded in thought. Then, what is the reward? The corners of Dannett's mouth widened as he said in a condescending manner, the Iron-Blooded Knight's supplementary ingredient list and the advancement ritual. Anderson didn't respond. He didn't say a word as he focused his gaze on Dannett's for nearly 10 seconds. Then, as though he was burning with impatience, he threw away the book in his hand and stood up. He said with a bright smile, "When do we set off?" Backlaund, East Borough, in a rental apartment that had its curtains drawn. Trissy, who was dressed in a black dress, packed her luggage, preparing to head to her next hideout. Her slightly round face was a little slimmer than before. Apart from her sweet smile, she had an indescribable, elegant, and beautiful look. Even though she was in the dirty and chaotic East Borough, she seemed to be untainted by any dirt. Trissy didn't immediately pick up her black suitcase. After looking around, she walked to the desk and unfolded a piece of paper. She picked up a pen and wrote, "Mr. Gehrman Sparrow, I've obtained the information I need from that captain of the Royal Guards. He is truly loyal to King George III. You should understand what this means. Next, my goal is to figure out what this king wants. For that, I plan to oppose the Demonis Sex Saintess of White Katarina. She definitely knows the corresponding secrets. She's a Sequence 3, a Demonis of Unaging. She's very difficult to kill, and it's very difficult to capture her. I have to admit that just my strength alone isn't enough to deal with her. If you're interested and confident, we can try cooperating. You know how to contact me. Trissy." Putting down the pen, Trissy folded the letter and began setting up the ritual to summon Gehrman Sparrow's messenger. She had only written to the crazy adventurer now because she was worried that he would lock onto her hiding spot with the help of his messenger, and then teleport over, bringing help to launch an assault. Therefore, she waited until she was about to move before making the attempt. Although Trissy wasn't sure what Gehrman Sparrow's motives were and couldn't determine if he would launch a surprise attack on her, out of habit, she chose the most reliable method for her, just to be safe. After handing the letter to the messenger, "I'll leave and wait for Gehrman Sparrow to contact me. I'll try not to meet him until we begin taking action. I wonder what faction is hiding behind him. I have to focus on mobilizing and using him, and not to trust him too much. This is indeed troublesome, but it's sufficiently safe." As Trissy thought, she ended what she was busy with and took 2 steps back. Looking at the candlelight, she chanted in ancient Hermes, "I summon in my name, the spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the friendly creature that can be subordinated, the messenger that belongs to Gehrman Sparrow." Just as she finished speaking, the candlelight burgeoned and turned abnormally pale. Following that, a figure stepped out of the candlelight and wore a dark and complicated robe, holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads. The 4 heads had 8 bloodshot eyes that darted around simultaneously as they cast their gaze at Trissy. Trissy's pupils dilated as though she saw something extremely terrifying. Chapter 1044, Placing Herself in the Tides. Backlaund, St. George Borough, in a factory room filled with junk. Light flashed in a mirror filled with obvious cracks. Its surface turned dark and deep, as though it was connected to another world. Suddenly, a white hand reached out from under the mirror, as though it had penetrated through layers of aqueous waves. A figure walked out from the shadows. She was none other than the sweet and beautiful Demonis Trissy in a long black dress. There was a rare paleness to her face, as though her face had lost all its ruddiness. Her forehead was covered in dense beads of sweat. With a smacking sound, the suitcase in Trissy's hand fell to the ground. She could hardly suppress the horror in her eyes. She then muttered to herself blankly, "His messenger is actually an angel." At that moment, Trissy felt a chill run down her spine, as though a cold wind had blown at her. She had never expected how dangerous it would be to summon a messenger previously. Thankfully, the woman holding the 4 heads in her hands watched her silently for a while before she left without doing anything. 160, Buckland Street, inside Dwayne Dantes' mansion. "Who's it from?" Klein asked with anticipation as he received the letter from Miss Messenger. The four heads in Reinette Tinker's hands spoke one after another, vessel of dirtiness, darkness. This nickname. Klein was taken aback when he heard that. For a moment, he didn't immediately figure out who Miss Messenger was referring to. In his mind, the people who knew how to summon his messenger quickly flashed past, one by one, as he filtered through them. In a few seconds, he had the corresponding guess. Trissy. From what Klein knew, this demoness, who had been renamed to Trissy Cheek, might very well be one of the mediums for the primordial demoness awakening or descent upon the world. In such a situation, calling her a vessel wasn't wrong. And people who knew enough about the mysterious world knew that the primordial demoness was an evil goddess, one that was known as the ultimate bringer of the apocalypse that would end everything. She had the creation of the apocalypse and the destruction of everything as her mission. She also wielded authorities such as desires related to feelings and emotions. It wasn't very apt to describe her with dirtiness and darkness, but it was understandable. Similarly, dirtiness and darkness could also describe Trissy, who had been corrupted by the evil goddess to a certain extent. As expected of an angel. She actually dared to say that about the primordial demoness. Klein secretly marveled as he opened the letter and quickly read it. At that moment, he suddenly recalled something. He hurriedly looked at Miss Messenger and said, "What reaction did the sender have when she saw you?" "She was very scared." Reinette Tinker's three heads spoke one after another without giving the last one a chance to speak, as its head was simply left agape. Klein's expression turned slightly heavy as he deliberated and asked, "Did you mark her?" The head of Reinette Tinker, which failed to speak previously, rushed to speak. "No." The remaining three blonde, red-eyed heads added, "Because she had the aura of primordial." Klein fell silent for a few seconds before nodding. "I understand." After watching Miss Messenger step into the void and leave, he unfurled the piece of paper and quickly read Trissy's letter. "She actually sought me out to deal with Saintess of White Katarina. Isn't this exactly what I wanted to do?" Klein's eyes shimmered a few times as he immediately rummaged for a black sticky blob. Right on the heels of that, he transformed into Gehrman Sparrow and smeared the blob uniformly onto a tiny mirror in the room. After patiently waiting for nearly 10 minutes, the black sticky blob vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind. Klein had failed to contact demoness Trissy. As expected, Trissy, who has been corrupted by the primordial demoness to a certain extent, managed to identify Miss Messenger's level and was given a fright. She probably wouldn't communicate with Gehrman Sparrow anytime soon. Sigh, if I had known Miss Messenger is a special angel, I definitely wouldn't have let her appear in front of Trissy, or I would have informed her that if a demoness were to summon her, she can bring both the person and let her over. Klein sighed silently and could only blame it on his luck. At that moment, he suddenly heard a series of illusory pleas. In a dark alley in the Backlund Bridge area. Shio hid Wintry Blade and entered the area, looking around warily. "Not bad, you're getting more and more experienced." A deep male voice sounded, and a figure walked out from the darkness around the corner. He stood tall, wearing a golden mask that revealed his eyes, nostrils, mouth, and cheeks. It was none other than the MI9 member who had contacted Shio before. "Why did you contact me so urgently?" Shio asked. The golden-masked man didn't make any small talk and directly asked, "You still seem to be monitoring Viscount Stratford's surroundings. Have you discovered anything unusual recently?" Shio thought and said, "Yes." He had intimate contact with a girl of unknown origins. He made her visit him at his residence late at night several times. "I tried to track that woman down, but I failed both times. Also, Viscount Stratford suddenly went out in the middle of the night 2 days ago. I don't know where he went because I didn't manage to follow him." The golden-masked man tersely acknowledged this as he went deeper into the details. Shio answered according to the details she had seen back then. She only concealed the fact that she had met Shermaine in the carriage and how she had followed Viscount Stratford all the way outside the warehouse. "Not bad. Your persistence was rewarding. The golden-masked man nodded slightly. He didn't seem to doubt what Shio had said. He sighed and said, "With this, your contributions to us will increase significantly. To be frank, if this continues, you'll soon be able to accumulate the contributions needed for the Sequence 6 potion. However, before that, there will definitely be a strict examination. And with your background, it will fail the examination without a doubt. After all, I know it very well. Actually, there's no need for you to seek the truth. I know that this was the motivation for you to persist in continuing the mission regarding Viscount Stratford, but my personal suggestion is to put the matter aside. With your current sequence and abilities, it's enough to let your mother and brother lead a very good life. Don't worry, no one will cause you trouble. And if you wish to continue persisting, I cannot guarantee what will happen." Although Shio had already expected such an explanation, she was helpless in resisting her emotions and throbbing heart. She blurted out a question, "Who exactly are you?" "I'm just an ordinary mid-sequence beyonder," the golden-masked man said with a smile. "You might not know that the post of Captain of the Royal Guards has the corresponding authority in MI9. It's equivalent to a deputy director that handles matters related to the royal family. Back when your father was alive, I was his subordinate and had received his help in various aspects. After his passing, I, who didn't commit any wrongs or hide any matters, was removed from the core of MI9. See, I'm only responsible for informants on the outside like you." Upon saying that, the golden-masked man sighed. "Your father helped me a lot. So, after I recognized you, I deliberately made you become an informant under me. With the extent of my power, I provided you some help. I have a family of my own and my own life, so I can't take excessive risks or do anything too dangerous for you. Let's do this. I'll help you get the potion formula for Judge. Afterward, stop your contributions in your pursuit to advance your sequence. Do something that will improve your life. As for what you want to do or plan to do in private, I don't know, nor do I want to know." Shio fell into a daze. Her lips trembled as she said, "What kind of person was my father?" The golden-masked man sighed as he replied, "He was a really brave, noble, and just aristocrat, but he wasn't that perfect. He was impulsive, eager, prone to anger." Shio silently listened and had planned on asking further, but all she said was a phrase, "Thank you. Go back. After obtaining the Judge formula, I'll leave you a message to meet me," the golden-masked man said with a wave. After Shio completely disappeared from the alley's entrance, the golden-masked man was just about to turn around when a slightly ethereal voice sounded in his ears, "She's lying." She had tailed Viscount Stratford to the scene back then. "It's something that can be confirmed." The golden-masked man fell silent for a moment before saying to the shadow beside him, "She might have only been worried that this would arouse suspicion. How can she defeat Viscount Stratford at her sequence? Besides, wasn't it said that Viscount Stratford carried a Grade 1 sealed artifact? I believe that she likely didn't dare approach. Otherwise, she wouldn't even be able to survive." The slightly ethereal voice replied, "No matter what, since there is a doubt, we need to do further investigations. Don't inquire about it in the future." Outside the alley, Shio walked calmly along street lamps. She deliberately didn't mention that she had followed Viscount Stratford. This wasn't to hide the truth, to clear herself of suspicion, or to not invite trouble. In fact, that was contrary to her true motives. Before the Tarot Club, her plan was to say that she had followed Viscount Stratford to a particular warehouse in the dock area. Outside, she was scared off by a terrifying hurricane. This was more convincing and made it less prone to suspicion. However, after knowing that this matter piqued the World Gehrman Sparrow's interest, she secretly changed her mind and decided to use her explanation to garner suspicion. She felt that if she wanted to investigate the king's secret at her level, it might take another 3 to 5 years, or even longer. Perhaps, there wouldn't be any hope forever. But with the world's help, success was a possibility. As such, she was willing to bear the risks and place herself right in the middle of the tides. And today, before meeting the golden-masked man from MI9, Shio had prayed to Mr. Fool so that he could inform the world Gehrman Sparrow of her thoughts. Chapter 1045, Dreamwalker. Above the endless gray fog, in the magnificent and ancient palace. With one hand holding the unshadowed crucifix, and the other holding the sea god scepter, he was observing the real world through the crimson star that represented judgment. In his spiritual vision, apart from the short Miss Shio and the golden-masked MI9 officer, there was another person hidden in the dark alley. This was a man in his 30s. He didn't have any special features, and he looked like the typical Loanese man from the mid-north area. Not only did he blend into the shadows, but he also had the characteristic of automatically making people dismiss his existence. If he weren't above the gray fog and had true vision, Klein suspected that even he wouldn't be able to discover the person if he were there in person. He would only be able to outline the person with his spiritual intuition when the person took any abnormal actions. Hiding in the shadows with psychological invisibility? Half of it depends on an item, while the other half depends on his sequence. In conclusion, this isn't a demigod. That's right. In the eyes of the king's faction, Miss Shio is only a sequence 7 and doesn't have any notable mystical items. If the matter concerning Viscount Stratford was really related to her, there must be a mastermind behind her, or even a faction. In this situation where there are undercurrents surging about, letting a demigod who might know too much perform the investigation might throw them into a trap. And if a demigod who knows little of the situation were to do it, there might be a chance that the information to be leaked to the 3 churches and result in an impetus for them to be investigated. In this case, a sequence 5 or sequence 6 beyonder with trustworthy strength while also not knowing too many secrets due to his limitations in rank is an excellent choice. Klein silently said to himself, giving up the thought of teleporting over as Gehrman Sparrow to capture him. He couldn't get any useful information for now. He decided to wait patiently, waiting for the situation to change. Of course, it wasn't possible for him to continue monitoring from above the gray fog. If that happened, his physical body in the real world would be defenseless for prolonged periods of time. An accident would be disastrous. Hence, he created a batch of charms and handed it to Judgment, the magician, and the other Tarot Club members. They were to immediately activate the charms if the situation deteriorated. That way, they could receive the help of the world. This would be simpler than directly reciting the honorific name of the fool to get him to forward the information. This was inspired from the Evernight coat of arms that the ascetic leader of the Church of Evernight, Ariana, had provided him. It was equivalent to a solidified ritual that pointed to him. From a mysticism angle, the principle wasn't complicated. The difficulty needed in carrying out the ritual was that the target could react upon receiving the news from a distance away. This was to mean that for a limited distance, a sequence 3 saint was fine, but for unlimited distances, it needed to be at the angel level. As a newly advanced demigod, Gehrman Sparrow was able to allow the charm to be useful because, when he made it, he used the corresponding honorific name and symbol of sea god Calvetua, and with the help of the gray fog, he could respond throughout the world. It sounded a little complicated, but simply put, he had made use of his other identity's level. As for the materials used for the charms, they were mostly tin, extremely easy to obtain and cheap. In the Backlund Bridge area, Shio had both hands in her brown jacket pockets as she strolled leisurely along the streets. Under the light of a street lamp that was quite a distance away, her expression was relatively calm, but she was unusually tense. The hands in her pocket either held the handle of the wintry blade through a hole while the other was holding onto a charm made of tin with some force. That was the summoning charm provided by the world Gehrman Sparrow. As she walked, she made several detours without suffering from any ambush. The night remained quiet and tranquil. Initially, she was worried that the king's faction would be able to openly capture her through MI9 or other official organizations and bring her back for an investigation. In this case, summoning Mr. World would only lead him into an extremely awkward and dangerous situation. It was equivalent to being at odds with all the official factions in Backlund. But later, she realized that such a development wouldn't occur. This was because her existence would be exposed to the 3 churches. When that happens, the ones doing the investigation definitely wouldn't be the King's faction inside MI9. The investigation must be done in secret. The person that appears might not even be someone from the military. Well, they're still watching, afraid that I'm only bait? Mr. World said not to trouble him if we can resolve it ourselves. Shio looked around her without letting down her guard. She didn't continue loitering outside and returned to the periphery of East Borough and entered her rented condominium. Frankly speaking, she didn't want to involve Force in this risky endeavor. However, the two of them were the ones who had been following Viscount Stratford. This meant that Force had also been put on the investigation list. Although, as long as Force hid in East Borough and seldom went out, it wasn't certain that MI9 could find her. Doing so would lead to the corresponding investigations to reach out further. Based on her past experience, family and friends, as well as people communicated by letters, would definitely be investigated. This easily affected others. Furthermore, if the two of them hid separately and didn't stay together, the feeling of them being bait became too obvious. It made it difficult for them to hook up any targets. After getting Force's approval, Shio finally chose to face the subsequent development with her friend. Opening the door and entering the house, Shio had just taken off her cap when she saw Force put down the magazine. She stood up, curled her hair, smiled, and asked, "You weren't followed, right?" This was a secret signal that the two of them had agreed upon ahead of time. On the surface, it showed their concern about being followed, but they were actually asking if they had been investigated. No. Shio shook her head seriously. Force didn't continue this topic. Instead, she went on and on, grumbling about how she couldn't buy any good tea leaves or alcoholic beverages in the vicinity. It required her to walk very far to find them. This warm and peaceful atmosphere continued till late at night. The two of them entered the bedroom and slept in a bunk bed. After the candles were extinguished, Shio was about to say something when a holy light suddenly appeared in front of her. The light instantly condensed into a silhouette, and 12 pairs of wings formed from scarlet flames appeared on its back. The figure descended and the layers of wings closed, enveloping Shio. Mr. Fool's angelic blessing. Shio was instantly enlightened. This was also a matter that she had solemnly asked Mr. Fool when she made the prayer to contact the World Gearman Sparrow, as she already knew that, apart from the Demonist sect, the Psychology Alchemists was also working with the King's faction. And not only were Beyonders of the Spectator pathway capable of hypnosis, but they could also dreamwalk. They needed to be careful of any investigations that used these two powers. If she didn't prepare herself, she suspected that she wouldn't even detect an investigation that had been carried out, let alone be able to inform Mr. World. Everything quickly calmed down. Shio opened her mouth and said to Force, who was sleeping in the bunk beneath her, "Good night." "Good night." Force didn't react in time, as though she was almost falling asleep. This made Shio realize that she had also received the angelic blessings. Time ticked by and the two fell asleep. After an unknown period of time, the dazed Shio suddenly snapped awake, aware that she was dreaming. Right on the heels of that, she felt something shadowy floating in the dark sky, and all kinds of thoughts from deep within her heart surged out to form a dream. These thoughts were mainly things that she had been most keenly aware of recently, including the night she barged into the warehouse and attacked Viscount Stratford. At first, Shio was a little frightened. She wanted to wake up from her dream, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't extricate herself from that state. It was as though she was still in a dream even when she opened her eyes. She quickly calmed down and tried to control those thoughts, only to realize that it wasn't difficult. Thus, the memories of the attacks on Viscount Stratford were buried. However, after some consideration, Shio deliberately didn't do it well, leaving some clues behind. In the dreamland, she and Force discovered that something weird had happened inside the warehouse, but it wasn't the same account she gave to MI9 that the tornado tore through the roof. Furthermore, they didn't escape immediately. Shio believed that this would allow the person who invaded her dreams to notice a problem but be unable to resolve it. After this, the investigators would confirm that there was a demigod or some faction behind the two of them. They would then believe that they weren't too difficult to deal with because the level of the secret wasn't too high. This way, it was likely that they would send a demigod to deal with the aftermath. And this was a development that Xiao anticipated. After all, every demigod had a high probability of knowing the king's secrets due to the positions they occupied. At this moment, Xiao's dream began to turn scattered, as though she had escaped some sort of guidance. She knew that this was a sign of the intruder leaving. For the rest of the night, nothing abnormal happened to her in force. The sky lit up and the morning sun's rays started to emanate through the thin fog. After breakfast, Audrey brought along her big golden retriever, Susie, her personal servant, Annie, and her bodyguard. They boarded their carriage as usual and headed for the LotM Charity Bursary Foundation at 22 Phelps Street. The chiming of bells rang out from the outside occasionally, bringing with them some sort of special energy. It made Audrey turn to look at the street and take in the sights of people coming and going. This calmed her down and made her feel more energized. She only felt that the whole world was filled with vibrancy. Just then, from the corner of her eye, Audrey saw a figure in the carriage. The figure was wearing a black three-piece suit, a dark red bow tie, and held a top hat in his hand. His hair was completely white, but it was still thick. His light blue eyes seemed to contain infinite wisdom. This was Vin Rambis, the psychology alchemist's counselor, a demigod from the Spectator pathway. Suddenly, Audrey fell into a daze, as though she had lost all her vigilance and wariness. In the carriage, Susie, Annie, and the others wore vacant looks as though they had entered a state of blankness. Vin Rambis's gentle voice rang out, two things. Firstly, don't you know Forz and Xiao? Arrange to meet them and hypnotize them. Chapter 1046, A Test. That gentle voice seemed to resonate with the thoughts deep in Audrey's heart. She only felt a little resistant to it before feeling as though it came from her heart, and that it was her truest thoughts. Vin Rambis looked at her emerald green eyes and said unhurriedly, secondly, in the upcoming banquets and balls, don't be as opposed as before to the few princes who take the initiative to show their fondness. Also, praise them a few times in front of Earl Hall and his wife. Remember all of the above, this is the reflection of your subconscious. Then, forget that I once said these things to you. Forget that this behavior is different from your usual behavior. Don't try to seek blessings, and stay away from key spots in the Church of Evernight's Mass. With that said, Vin Rambis retracted his gaze from Audrey's eyes. He turned to cue Annie and the rest, preventing them from being surprised by their mistress's subsequent odd behavior. After dealing with all these things, he disappeared from the carriage without causing a stir. Ring! Another bike passed by the window as Audrey's slightly anxious eyes recovered their luster. She looked at the people on the street coming and going when she suddenly let out a soft exclamation. Then, embarrassed, she turned her head to say to Annie and the rest, I forgot something. I have to visit Klein first. At this moment, the carriage hadn't left Empress Borough and wasn't too far from Viscount Klein's residence. The servants like Annie didn't find it strange or become put in a difficult position. They quickly instructed the coachman to turn into another street. This continued until 20 minutes to 10 in the morning. Audrey finally arrived at Phelps Street. She walked into the second floor of the LotM Charity Bursary Foundation and entered her director's office. Looking at Annie and the others either organizing documents or using the spring water they brought alone to prepare black tea, Audrey brought Susie along to the lounge that was attached to her office. It was as though she wanted to check on her face to determine if she needed her lady's maid to help touch up her makeup. During this process, Audrey glanced at the keyhole and asked Susie in a relaxed manner, was there anything abnormal with my behavior today? This was a habit that she had only gotten in the past few days. It had only started from the moment Vin Rambis disappeared. She knew that Mr. Fool's angelic blessing wasn't permanent. It could only be sustained for some time, and she wasn't able to determine when Vin Rambis would visit her. When that happens, she wouldn't have the time to pray to Mr. Fool and do the corresponding preparations. Therefore, from her understanding and cautious attitude towards psychology and mysticism, she not only checked her behavior 3 times a day for any abnormalities or for any excessive coincidences, but she also instructed Susie to take note of her condition and be her mirror. This was a precautionary measure of being hypnotized by Vin Rambis and cued without realizing it. Susie sat by the side and thought seriously before saying, "Yes." Audrey's smiling expression stiffened. She quickly looked at Susie and waited for her explanation. Susie wriggled her nose and looked around before continuing, "You didn't plan on paying a visit to Viscount Glaint when you left the house, but you changed your schedule halfway. You'll inform me of the general schedule ahead of time over the past few days. Also, you said that you would discuss it with me if you decide to suddenly change or add to the schedule." Upon hearing Susie's reply, Audrey's expression turned grave. She still didn't feel that there was anything unusual about this matter, but this situation was extremely abnormal. This made her almost certain. Vin Rambis had been here before, right after she left her house and before she headed for Glaint's residence. The other party had already cued and hypnotized her and removed all traces. However, he didn't exhort a dog, making it feel like everything that it saw was normal. Audrey subconsciously wanted Susie to leave so that she could pray to Mr. Fool, but she was hesitant. Would my current behavior be monitored by Vin Rambis? Will he be sitting somewhere in this room and quietly be watching me? No, if that were to happen, he would have discovered a problem when I asked Susie. Praying wouldn't make the outcome any worse. Even if he's here, Mr. Fool would also discover it. I can promise a future sacrifice and pray that he directly send divine punishment. However, why don't I wish to pray and ask for help? Audrey stood there, all kinds of feelings running through her as she instinctively wanted to escape. This made her realize the contradiction, and she realized that there was a bit of resistance in her heart. From the perspective of psychology and mysticism, she had a vague guess. She quickly put aside the idea of seeking help, allowing herself to be in her usual state of praying to the goddess without the desire of getting a response. This greatly reduced the conflict in her heart. Audrey instantly became confident. She gestured for Susie to leave first, then she looked into the mirror and began softly hypnotizing herself. "You're not asking for help. You're only doing your usual prayers. You're not asking for help. You're only doing your usual prayers." After repeating it over and over again, the vortex deep in the light greenness of Audrey's eyes that could suck a person's soul slowly dissipated, and her eyes returned to normal. She then raised both her hands and placed them between her mouth and her nose. Then, she chanted in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. I might have met Vin Rambis." As she spoke, she didn't mention any desire for any help but described her discovery. After waiting for a while, a deep red light appeared in front of Audrey, drowning her like a tidal wave. Suddenly, her thoughts became clear, and images flashed across her mind. It was Vin Rambis in his black 3-piece suit, who was sitting in a horse carriage, sitting opposite her. It was the elder who had exhorted her with a gentle voice. It was the demigod from the Spectator pathway whose light blue eyes that seemed to contain infinite wisdom and vortices. At the same time, those words resounded in Audrey's ears again, making her remember everything that had happened. After the crimson glow disappeared, she saw the long bronze table in front of her. Sitting at the seat of honor at the end of the table was a figure shrouded in the grayish-white fog. As emotions of fear, horror, and panic surged through her, she stood up, lifted her skirt, and curtsied to the great existence. "Thank you for your blessings, Honorable Mr. Fool." Klein nodded and smiled approvingly. "You handled it well." Upon hearing this, Audrey suddenly felt at ease, no longer as nervous as before. She sat down and calmly described what had happened to her. As the Fool, there was no way for him to directly discuss things with Miss Justice, analyze it for her, or give suggestions. All he did was smile and say, "This is a test of fate." "A test? Only through this test will I have the qualifications to become a demigod, so that I can protect the people I want to protect in Backland, which is in a state of turmoil." Audrey interpreted Mr. Fool's hint and nodded seriously. "I understand." Without another word, Klein sighed and smiled. "Go back and welcome it." Audrey was about to express her gratitude again when the crimson light appeared before her eyes, blurring everything she saw. In the blink of an eye, she returned to the real world, but she didn't forget or ignore anything a test. Does that mean that I have to resolve the danger of Vin Rambis without exposing my secrets? Even if I caused the death of Vin Rambis, I still wouldn't be suspected by the psychology alchemists? How should I do that? Audrey looked at the abnormally beautiful blonde in the mirror. She turned her head slightly and glanced slightly to the side. There was a large lounge in that direction. It belonged to the director who didn't have any responsibilities in the Foundation. Just 10 minutes ago, Audrey had seen Mr. Dwayne Dantes inside when she was heading up the stairs. Above the gray fog, Klein's fingers tapped on the edge of the long model table as he analyzed what had happened between Miss Justice and Miss Judgment last night. That's not right. Adam had given me the unshadowed crucifix through Miss Judgment and Miss Magician. How could he not know which existence is behind them? What other test needs to be done? Last night, I thought that the investigation of Miss Shio was purely an action from the King's faction where they only used the help of a mid-sequence beyonder from the psychology alchemists. And for some reason, Adam didn't share any information of the Fool with the King's faction or the Demonist sect. After all, he still hopes that I can give him some feedback. But from the looks of it, this probe has Adam involved in it. Otherwise, Vin Rambis wouldn't be involved in this matter. Even for the Twilight Hermit Order, a saint is rather precious and important. They wouldn't give one up so easily as a sacrifice. What is Adam trying to test? He is testing to see if Miss Judgment's investigation of Viscount Stratford and her subsequent actions were purely by her own choice, or if it had the will of the Fool involved. If the Fool gets the unshadowed crucifix and realizes that the King's secret is related to Adam's scheme while still insisting that his subordinates investigate it, that will be making the Twilight Hermit Order an enemy. And Adam knows that Gehrman Sparrow is a blessed. But with Adam's abilities, there's no need to test out anything. Just sitting next to Miss Judgment and listening to her true thoughts will be enough to grasp the actual situation. There's no need to go through so much effort. Unless he has already left Backlund, or rather, to avoid certain problems, he doesn't dare enter this big city again, and can only investigate it through his subordinates. My warning to Ms. Ariana and the Church of Evernight has taken effect, causing Adam to sense the danger of a divine descent? Probably. Even though he knows that Gehrman Sparrow has something to do with the death console, he probably wouldn't notice that something has happened to Artificial Death. Even the Numinous Episcopate's Artificial Death faction hasn't noticed a thing, therefore, with the authority of concealment augmenting this, he has no idea that the goddess wouldn't be able to carry out a divine descent for a long period of time. Next up, I'll have to deal with Vin Rambis. I must make sure that Miss Justice is steered clear so as to not have any relations and isn't suspected. Just as this thought crossed his mind, he saw Miss Justice Audrey enter the director's lounge through her prayer light in search of Dwayne Dantes. He quickly reined in his thoughts and returned to the real world. Chapter 1047, Brainstorm. Good morning, where's Mr. Dantes? Audrey smiled politely as she asked the young male valet that was of Lowen and East Balham descent. Enuni bowed and said, he went to the washroom and will be back soon. Honorable lady, do you wish to wait here? All right. Audrey found a single-seater and sat down with all sorts of thoughts running through her mind. Frankly speaking, if she only had to deal with Vin Rambis, she had already come up with a concrete plan. It was to hypnotize herself in advance. When Vin Rambis came to gather feedback, she would activate the world Gehrman Sparrow's charm without any ill intent. Then, she would work with the crazy adventurer to hunt the demigod. Humph, in order to ensure that there aren't any problems, I can also make a request to Ma'am Hermit for help. She's already a demigod and can lurk in the darkness. She can then combine forces with Mr. World at the critical moment. That way, Vin Rambis likely wouldn't be able to escape. Audrey pursed her lips as she held back from grinding her teeth. As for how the hermit was to come to Backlund, she didn't find it problematic. She could rent Lamino's travels and get Mr. World to record teleport before requesting Mr. Fool to pass it to her. But this way, even if Vin Rambis didn't manage to escape, the psychology alchemists would have ample reason to suspect that the murderer was the last person the demigod had interacted with, Audrey herself. And this means that there would be countless troubles in the future. Audrey's eyes shifted slightly as she tried hard to calm herself down. At that moment, the white-sideburned and elegant Dwayne Dantes returned from the washroom. He smiled and greeted the noble lady who was waiting for him. After letting his valet, Anuni, guard the door, this tycoon looked around before finally turning his gaze to Audrey. "You seem to have encountered some difficulty?" Audrey didn't interpret Mr. World's actions and replied frankly, "Yes." She gave a description of what she had encountered and said, "What should I do to solve the problem?" What she really meant was how she could avoid leaving behind any remnant problems for the future. Klein smiled and said, "Why don't you discuss it with the two ladies?" "That's right. Like Mr. Moon, we can request for a private mini-gathering. Oh, Judgment Shio, the magician force will definitely participate. Apart from them, I can also invite Mr. World, Mr. Hanged Man, Ma'am Hermit, Mr. Moon, I can count him out." Audrey felt excited for some baffling reason. At this moment, she felt as though she wasn't fighting alone. "I understand." Audrey nodded with a smile. She then thought of another problem and quickly took the opportunity to ask, "Vin Rambis has made me no longer reject the princes and praise them in front of my parents. What's his motive?" Klein thought for a moment and said, "Perhaps it's to show some kind of friendliness on the surface. It's to rope in your father and make a hint to the Church of Evernight behind him. Regardless of the king's secret, whether it succeeds or not, he will definitely need at least one Orthodox church's support so as to reduce the opposing forces." "Is that so?" Audrey didn't really reject Mr. World's explanation. This was the politics she was familiar with if she stripped off the outer shell that involved beyond her powers. She didn't stay any longer and returned to her own office. After settling her daily affairs, she grasped her afternoon break and prayed to Mr. Fool and applied for a mini-gathering to be convened. Above the endless grayish-white fog, dark red beams rose up around the long bronze table. Audrey looked around, stood up, and curtsied to the other members. "Everyone, I have something I wish to hear from you." "It sounds urgent," Alger nodded gently and replied. Audrey sat down and said, "Yes." She then looked at Shio and Force. "I met Vin Rambis this morning. He hypnotized me to do two things for him and to forget his appearance. Fortunately, I was quite careful and cautious. I quickly discovered something odd, and thanks to Mr. Fool's blessings, I remembered everything. One of the things Vin Rambis asked me to do was to arrange for a meeting with Miss Magician and Miss Judgment and take the opportunity to hypnotize them. I'll then obtain intel on the instigator for the actions they had recently taken and also get them to leave Backlund as quickly as possible." "What?" Force was originally worried about Miss Justice's safety, but she never expected things to make one rotation before coming back at her and Shio. To think they targeted Miss Audrey. It's really hard to guard against them. She's targeted by a demigod. After a moment of shock, Force felt more astonished and afraid. She couldn't help but look at her friend and saw Shio sitting calmly, but her hands had unconsciously clenched into fists. Catalia didn't understand something as she frowned and asked, "The psychology alchemists, or should I say Vin Rambis, discovered that Miss Judgment and Miss Judgment are members of our tarot club. This was a very serious and crucial matter." Audrey shook her head and said, "No, it's only because I know them in the real world." At that moment, she no longer tried to hide her identity from Force and Shio. In fact, ever since Shio joined the club and obtained the Judgment card, Audrey knew that she would be exposed sooner or later. Through repeated observations, she had confirmed that her two friends had already guessed it, but they tacitly didn't expose her. "You know them?" Catalia asked in surprise as she adjusted her heavy glasses. Audrey nodded. "Yes, they were actually recommended by me. Mr. Hangman can testify." "Ah. Didn't we chant Mr. Fool's honorific name because we wanted to save ourselves and get pulled in here? How did it become a recommendation process?" Force looked at Miss Justice blankly before glancing at Shio, her face blank and confused. Xiao also had that rare, similar expression because the word recommended had exceeded what she knew as well as her speculations. Audrey felt a little embarrassed. She blinked and explained to her two friends, because all of you have your own special qualities, and I also hope that the Tarot Club will develop and expand, I recommended the two of you to Mr. Fool. However, this was just a chance for you. If you hadn't passed Mr. Fool's test, he wouldn't have pulled you in. Test? What kind of test did I undergo? Fours was still confused. As for Xiao, she thought of many things, especially the origins of the paper that had Mr. Fool's honorific name, as well as her frantic search for an exorcism. No wonder I had an inkling that they knew each other. No wonder Misjudgment only entered the club after so long. This was probably due to their different individual experiences. Each of them has their own specialties. This specialty is the selection criteria? Do I have one? Catalia came to a realization as she came up with a theory. Upon seeing this, Alger, who had some level of judgment regarding this, wasn't at all surprised as he chuckled and said, "We can talk about this in the future. Miss Justice, the problem you would like to ask about is how to deal with Vin Rambis." Yes. Audrey returned to the topic and asked seriously, if we not only have to deal with Vin Rambis but are the psychology alchemists from suspecting me, what should I do? Alger didn't have any experience in dealing with a demigod, so all he could do was rely on his insight that had been built up over the years. He deliberated and said, lock onto the whereabouts of Vin Rambis. Only take action after he has interacted with someone else? How do I lock onto him? Audrey asked the question herself before giving the answer. After getting the answer from Miss Judgment and Miss Magician, I'll wait until Vin Rambis leaves after I meet him again. Then, I'll recite Mr. Fool's honorific name and ask him to cast his gaze on the demigod. Theoretically, it's possible. My true vision above the gray fog has a radius of nearly 10 kilometers. As long as Vin Rambis doesn't know teleport, I can confirm his location and trajectory for a short period of time. Then, I can return to the real world and directly teleport over. This will require the help of divination. But the problem is that it requires the Fool to personally intervene. As the world Gehrman Sparrow, Klein said in a hoarse voice, let me remind you of something. Miss Judgment and Miss Magician had mentioned Adam in the real world. The psychology alchemists originated from the ruins of Hermes, who is a member of the Twilight Hermit Order. And Mr. Fool doesn't wish to be at odds with the Twilight Hermit Order because of this matter. Even if we were to do anything, we must try not to let the other party know. This string of words contained a lot of information that made Alger, Catalia, and the rest feel like they were seriously experiencing a literal brainstorm. Xiao and Force were even more shocked. So that organization is called the Twilight Hermit Order. Mr. Fool doesn't want to be its enemy over this matter. Is it because he had just finished collaborating with the Angel of Imagination Adam over the matter of Ensanguil? I never expected the psychology alchemists to be related to the Twilight Hermit Order. Wait, Hermes? He's still alive? He's actually a member of the Twilight Hermit Order? The members of this organization are really unimaginably important figures? Alger first glanced at Gehrman Sparrow before failing to resist the urge to look at Catalia. He realized that the latter was equally shocked without hiding it. The Twilight Hermit Order. Is this the ancient secret organization that Emperor Roselle joined? Catalia mumbled to herself as if she was seeking confirmation. Gehrman Sparrow gave the answer, yes. After you return to the real world, it's best if you don't think about matters like this again. You'll easily be detected. If you don't trust yourself, you can get Miss Justice to give you some psychological cues. Chapter 1048, Real and Fake Spy. In the ancient palace above the gray fog, with the world Gehrman Sparrow's words coming to an end, no one spoke for a moment. The entire place was silent. The psychology alchemists are cooperating with the king's faction and are investigating Xiao and I. The founding of the psychology alchemists originated from the discovery of a Hermes ruins, and Hermes is a member of the Twilight Hermit Order. Its leader happens to be Angel of Imagination Adam. And Xiao and I had mentioned Adam in the real world. We're in the sights of a king of angels. In the world of mysticism, just a slight mistake can result in such dangerous circumstances. Forza's mind was filled with Gehrman Sparrow's warnings as she was gripped by horror and panic. Although she had experienced many things in the past, she had never had such a clear realization of the thorny path Beyonders tread. Any mistakes could lead to a terrible consequence. I have to be more cautious in the future. Of course, the premise is that I can survive under the watch of King of Angels Adam. May Mr. Fool bless me. Force seriously reflected on the matter and silently prayed. Xiao also didn't expect her situation to be so perilous. She didn't expect that something like this would involve a king of angels. She couldn't help but feel horrified and fearful, but she had already decided to sacrifice herself for the truth. She rapidly calmed down, but couldn't help but shoot a glance at the magician, feeling guilty for pulling her good friend into this conundrum. At this point in time, crying and feeling remorse won't solve the problem anymore. All I can do is try my best to keep Force alive at the critical moment. Fortunately, there's still Mr. Fool's blessings. Xiao cast her gaze at Justice Audrey as she thought to herself. Then what should we do next? She had mixed feelings towards Miss Justice's recommendation. On the one hand, she knew that Audrey thought highly of the Tarot Club and had recommended her purely out of good intentions. On the other hand, she felt that she had gained the notice of a secret existence for no good reason. Thankfully, it was Mr. Fool, or she would have died a tragic death long ago. Even her soul wouldn't be able to receive deliverance. Well, I guess it's because I voluntarily chanted Mr. Fool's honorific name that I was dragged into it. There wasn't any coercion. Ultimately, I'm sitting here of my own volition. It has nothing to do with Miss Justice. Also, if it weren't for her recommendation, I might never have such an opportunity to grow stronger to seek out the truth. Xiao pursed her lips as she furtively took a deep breath. Justice Audrey knew about the relationship between the Twilight Hermit Order, Hermes, and Adam, so she was the calmest one there. She just never expected that Force and Xiao's casual mention of the Angel of Imagination had garnered his attention. This made her have an unprecedented awareness of the horror behind the words, "Any mention of it will be known." After some deliberation, Audrey looked at the world Gehrman Sparrow and tried to interpret his words. Does Mr. Fool mean that he doesn't want to directly make an enemy of the Twilight Hermit Order at the moment? Does that mean that it can be done indirectly? Klein nodded slightly and said, that should be the case. Does it involve interfering with divination, one's attention, and prophecies? Audrey asked. At this mini-gathering, the world Gehrman Sparrow represented the will of the Fool. Klein laughed and hoarsely said, perhaps a little more indirect. He answered vaguely because the Fool hadn't thought of what to do either. Their conversation seemed to inspire Alger. He looked at Justice, the Magician, and Judgment, one after another. Which of you is a believer of the Evernight Goddess? He was almost certain that at least one of the three ladies believed in the Evernight Goddess. After all, among the people of Lowen and the residents of Backlund, the standards for women, and those who had been educated, these filtered out most of the believers of other deities. I am, Xiao said without hiding anything. Audrey raised her hand slightly. Seeing this, Alger nodded slightly. We can try to mislead someone and make it seem like the Church of Evernight did something against Vin Rambis, not the Tarot Club. As he said this, Alger skillfully changed the pronoun he used to refer to the group. He was only invited to be a consultant and wouldn't actually be involved in the matter. He should have said you should do this and that, but he had chosen to use we. Pushing the blame to the Church of Evernight. This line of thought seems really familiar. Klein and the world Gehrman Sparrow's manifestations suddenly found it amusing. Then how should the misdirection be done? Audrey's eyes shifted slightly as she hurriedly asked. Alger looked around and said, Vin Rambis only hypnotized you to not seek blessings and sit in key spots at the Church of Evernight's Mass where you can be cleansed to a certain degree. But he didn't ask you to avoid the Church of Evernight's Archbishop. You can use this to create an opportunity. Meet the Archbishop, of course, there's no need to say anything. This way, when Vin Rambis dies or vanishes, the psychology alchemists will most probably suspect that the Church of Evemite had detected something wrong with you and had set up a trap. Without waiting for Miss Justice to respond, he looked at Shio. After you're hypnotized, but before you leave Backland, head to the nearest church of the Evernight Goddess and pray seriously. Act like a spy sent by the Church of Evernight to infiltrate the Tarot Club. This will misdirect the psychology alchemists into believing that the matters pertaining to Vin Rambis were done by the Tarot Club, but was in fact a smokescreen. The true mastermind behind all of this is the Church of Evemite. Acting like a spy in the Tarot Club that was sent by the Church of Evernight. Well, Klein felt a little guilty. He was a genuine blessed of Evernight. And Leonard was a genuine Red Glove. It should be said that the Tarot Club's convener and host, Mr. Fool, also draws the crimson moon on his chest. Klein muttered in amusement and helplessness. As a result, he was also rather inspired. This can only fool typical Beyonders. Without the blessings of Mr. Fool's angel, the higher-ups of the psychology alchemists can easily figure out the truth, Catalia reminded. The Hanged Man replied, so, the main point is that we should be indirectly blessed by Mr. Fool. Otherwise, would it be impossible for us to deceive the Spectator Pathway's King of Angels, Adam? Also, Miss Magician and Miss Judgment, when you pray at the Cathedral of the Evernight Goddess, it's best if you pray to Mr. Fool and get his help in extricating yourself from the hypnosis and not immediately leave Backland. Under such circumstances, Backland is safer than anywhere else. All right, Shio replied seriously. Seeing that the discussion had reached this point, Audrey and the others all looked towards the World Gearman Sparrow, awaiting his response. Klein's thoughts had already taken shape. He deliberated for a moment, then laughed hoarsely. Actually, there are simpler ways to interfere. What methods are there? Audrey's eyes widened as she asked with concern. Klein looked at Miss Justice and pointed at the top of his head. Once Vin Rambis leaves, bum that hat accessory and trigger the charm I gave you. That feather hat accessory? The hat accessory that can get a so-called response from death? Mr. World hopes to get this existence to disrupt the divination, attention, and prophecy. Audrey's green eyes sparkled as she nodded in thought. I know what to do. When that happens, the response would be the power of concealment. This way, no matter what happens, Adam can only assume that the goddess had interfered, believing that she had blessed the Hall family and has nothing to do with the Tarot Club. I wonder if the goddess will send Ma'am Ariana. That way, finishing off Vin Rambis will be made very simple. If not, I'll give myself Angel's Embrace ahead of time and use my marionettes which are dead. That will result in a high chance of victory. Klein mumbled inwardly without saying anything else. Just as Audrey quickly completed her plan, doing so as though she was talking to herself as she spoke to Shio and Fours, visit me on Wednesday afternoon. This way, I'll have a chance to see the Church of Evernight's Archbishop in advance. I'll pray to Mr. Fool for him to provide his angelic blessings. That way, I won't be hypnotized by Vin Rambis when I meet him. We'll act once he leaves. Vin Rambis is a cautious and conservative person. He should continue choosing to meet me on the way to prevent himself from being caught or from falling into a trap. Soon, amidst the discussions of the other members of the Tarot Club, the plan was complete. The World Gearman Sparrow declined Catalia's suggestion of providing help. After all, he couldn't guarantee that powerhouses from the Church of Evernight would be involved. As for the payment, all the spoils would belong to the world, and Audrey would provide him with a free help commission according to his request. On Wednesday afternoon, in Viscount Glaint's residence. After returning to the Turf Club, Audrey, who was wearing a simple white dress shirt and a pair of pants of the same, bright leather boots, and a black leather jacket that clung to her waist, stood inside the Viscount's study and looked at Shio and Fours. Who got you to investigate Viscount Stratford and pursue the king's secret? Her green eyes were like an ancient pool of water in a deep mountain. It was quiet, deep and clear, making one unknowingly sink into it. At this moment, Shio and Fours were really hypnotized. The former answered in a daze, "It was me." I'm investigating the cause of my father's death. However, I do pray to a particular existence to bless me. Audrey asked a few more questions and received a satisfactory answer. Then, she said with a gentle voice, "Leave Backlund and leave this place. You don't belong here. All right, you'll wake up when you hear me clap." The moment she said that, Audrey clapped her hands and saw Shio and Forza's eyes regain their clarity. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, Shio and Forza bade her farewell and left. Audrey began to wait patiently. She planned to stay inside Viscount Glaint's residence for another half an hour. She was waiting for Shio to enter the nearest Evernight Goddess Cathedral and finish her prayers before heading elsewhere. This way, regardless of whether Vin Rambis appeared en route or elsewhere, she would be prepared. Picking up the lady's bonnet with a white feather accessory, Audrey walked out of the study, planning to meet up with Susie and Annie first before chatting with Glaint to kill time. She had just taken 2 steps when she heard a gentle and smiling voice, "Well done." Audrey's pupils dilated as she hurriedly turned her head, only to see a silver-haired man standing next to an elegant wall lamp rack. His eyes were light blue, and his clothes were neat. He was none other than Vin Rambis. This demigod was actually waiting in Viscount Glaint's residence for Audrey to complete the hypnosis and receive the answer. At this moment, Shio and Force probably hadn't walked out the main door. This was completely outside Audrey's expectations and the hangman's analysis. This meant that Vin Rambis was present, so there was no need to question the target through Audrey. Being in the vicinity and personally hypnotizing them was just as dangerous. Chapter 1049, Spectator's Intuition. How did this happen? Even if Shio and Force didn't meet with any delays en route and maintain a relatively fast speed, it would take at least 15 minutes to arrive at the nearest Evernight Cathedral. Luckily, I was cautious enough and had prayed to Mr. Fool for an angelic blessing ahead of time. I also actually hypnotized Shio and Force. An upheaval of thoughts instantly ran through her mind before she rapidly suppressed them. At first, she looked confused, and then her face wore a look of realization. It was as if she had finally woken up from her long dream and remembered the things that had been neglected. "Mr. Rambis, why are you here?" Audrey made her voice sound ethereal, as though she was still in a dreamy stupor. As she spoke, she made use of the control of her emotions as a psychiatrist to make an unavoidable hint of anxiety flash through her mind, doing so without causing any abnormalities. This unexpected turn of events made her unsure of how to proceed. Without a doubt, she understood that she had to first deal with Vin Rambis's subsequent questions so that the demigod wouldn't suspect anything. However, if that was the case, he would leave in 3 to 5 minutes after he was done asking. As for Shio and Force, they definitely wouldn't have entered an Evernight Cathedral yet. This inhibited the step needed for the misdirection, and when the time came, igniting the hat accessory and summoning the world easily exposed flaws in the handling of matters in the end. They wouldn't be able to completely fix the inherent problems. No, I'd rather miss this opportunity than proceed with the plan without being fully prepared. Patience, tolerance, and caution are key in the mysterious world. At the very least, Vin Rambis will be making use of me for a long period of time and not directly harm me. He wishes that I marry with some prince, and this process will take more than half a year. I still have plenty of time. I can wait for the second, third, or even fourth or fifth opportunity. The only problem is that I need to inform Shio and Force and get them to really hide as quickly as possible. Audrey quickly came up with a decision as her eyes restored to normal while showing hints of wariness and fear. After observing her reaction and hearing her question, Vin Rambis smiled and said, "This should be your first time hypnotizing someone, and I was worried that an accident would happen, so I specially came here to wait. Heh, given your background, you don't usually have the chance to do this." His voice was gentle and laced with concern. It made the wariness and fear in Audrey's eyes subside bit by bit. But in Audrey's mind world, she once again felt her consciousness being split apart. Some of them were raised, looking down at the island and the sea. This made her clearly realize that her fond feelings and sense of security that she had just felt were all artificial. Seeing that Audrey had returned to normal, Vin Rambis nodded and said, "How did they answer your question just now?" Audrey honestly said, "Shio said that the investigation of Viscount Stratford and the pursuit of the king's secret was all of her own will. She was very suspicious about the death of her father. Her father was the former captain of the Royal Guards, Earl Mason Deer. However, she mentioned that her actions were blessed by a certain existence." As she answered, Audrey almost stopped talking. This was because her spirituality high in the sky was looking down at herself on the island of consciousness and the spiritual sea. She saw a figure rising up from the bottom of the sea as it followed up steps that appeared, passing through the subconscious realm and landing on her body of heart and mind's island. The figure was wearing a black three-piece suit, with a head full of silver hair. It was another Vin Rambis. There wasn't a hint of a smile on Vin Rambis's face. He had an extremely sinister air, and a part of his skin was covered in grayish-white scales. Not only did his eyes turn from pale blue to golden, they also turned vertical, looking like a particular animal. If it weren't for the fact that she had experienced something like this before, just the intense level of nervousness she currently felt might have prevented Audrey from acting as though she hadn't noticed anything while ensuring that she didn't stop speaking or end up stammering. In the real world, Vin Rambis smiled as he looked at Audrey's pretty face and asked further, "Which existence's blessings?" Audrey shook her head as the island of consciousness began to change. When this matter was raised, Shio and Force became very resistant. There were signs of escaping the hypnosis, so I didn't dare continue asking. Of course, the blessings of a particular existence could be explained as Mr. Fool's attention, and it could also be understood as the goddesses. The lucid Audrey muttered silently under the spiritual sky. Vin Rambis continued to circle around the questions and asked about the details of the hypnosis. After 2 or 3 minutes, he nodded satisfactorily and said, "Not bad. You do have a gift in hypnotizing people. When the recent events come to a close, I will give you the Dreamwalker potion and personally host the ritual for you. Oh yes, don't reject love and marriage too much. You're not even 20 years old, and it's the perfect time to pursue such matters. Your charm is enough to gain everyone's affection and enjoy their attention." Vin Rambis used an indirect hint and guidance to lower Audrey's resistance towards love and marriage. This detestable guy. Audrey puffed up her cheeks under her spiritual sky and muttered resentfully. She then controlled herself to reveal some shyness and longing. Vin Rambis didn't expect to succeed by simply following a logical process. Seeing this, he retracted his invading consciousness and allowed himself to leave the island. He turned around and said, "Forget what I just said. They're all spontaneous thoughts from your heart. After I leave this place and disappear from your sight, you'll forget that I was here." Upon hearing this, Audrey under the spiritual sky couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. This meant that Vin Rambis was about to leave. Even though it had only been 5 minutes since his appearance, making it insufficient for Shio and Force to enter the nearest Evernight Cathedral, Audrey was still eager for Vin Rambis to leave as soon as possible. To face off a demigod of the Spectator domain was unimaginably stressful. There's still a chance after this. As long as I maintain my consciousness, there will still be a chance. Audrey, don't be depressed, don't be impatient. Audrey silently consoled herself as she watched Vin Rambis turn around and walk towards the hall. She didn't relax and didn't breathe. She tried her best to maintain her normal state. Suddenly, Vin Rambis stopped in his tracks and turned around. He narrowed his pale blue eyes and looked at Audrey. "Why were you so scared when you first saw me?" I was too surprised at that time, so I didn't manage to hide some of my emotions well." Audrey felt her scalp tingle under her long, blonde hair as her thoughts whirled quickly. She asked, puzzled, "Really? Isn't this normal?" Someone suddenly appeared beside me. A brief shock is inevitable. Vin Rambis nodded, as if agreeing with this explanation. He sized up Audrey and suddenly said, "You used to carry a mystical item that can change one's form with you as an accessory. Why didn't you wear it today?" To a spectator, this detail was an abnormality. Oh no! I've been hiding wide beneath my clothes most of the time. How did he notice that I wasn't wearing it this time? He has secretly read some of my memories that I didn't protect to appear normal. Faced with Vin Rambise's question, Audrey felt her thoughts stagnant. The reason why she wasn't wearing Y was simple: she was afraid that this accessory would amplify her emotions, preventing her from being able to completely hide her true thoughts when facing a demigod from the spectator pathway. This meant that she had predicted that she would meet Vin Rambis today. This was something that shouldn't have happened under normal circumstances. In the blink of an eye, Audrey grabbed onto an idea and smiled blankly. It will amplify my emotions and reduce the success rate of the hypnosis attempt. I removed it in advance to avoid any accidents. Vin Rambis nodded and said, "So that's the reason." Just as Audrey was feeling a little relaxed, this spectator pathway's demigod suddenly narrowed his eyes. "If it's just this matter, there's nothing worth suspecting. But compared to when you saw me, the fear that slightly exceeded normal limits seems to imply something." As he said that, Vin Rambise's light blue eyes turned vertical and was quickly dyed with the color of gold. The two golden vertical pupils clearly reflected Audrey's image in her rider's attire. With a buzz, Audrey's thoughts became extremely muddled. Only the her under the spiritual sky barely remained conscious. The surface of the spiritual sea surrounding the island surged with waves, enveloping it. At the same time, the sinister-looking Vin Rambis returned to the island and stopped beneath the sea surface, allowing patches of grayish-white dragon scales to fly into the foundation of the island where most of a human's subconscious lay. Audrey suddenly felt her thoughts twist, prompting her to say everything, confessing all her secrets. Relying on the lucidity of herself under the spiritual sky, she barely controlled herself and didn't reveal anything. She also knew that there would definitely be problems if this continued, so she quickly diverted some of her thoughts and, relying on the angelic blessing and her splintered consciousness, prevent Vin Rambis from noticing it. Some of those thoughts included reaching her hand into her left pocket. Just then, Vin Rambis, who had invaded her mind world, looked increasingly sinister as he snorted. "There really is a problem." If there wasn't a problem, Audrey would have started with the most important matters, revealing all her secrets and private matters one by one, instead of staying silent. Likewise, since the manipulation attempt happened so quickly, Audrey didn't have the time to sort out all her secrets. Even if she wanted to hide anything, her lucidity would be discovered the moment she spoke. After confirming that something was off, Vin Rambis didn't hesitate any longer. His gaze turned extremely cold as grayish-white scales covered his skin. The storm in the spiritual seat suddenly intensified, and Audrey, who was under the spiritual sky, staggered. The last bastion of the defenses of her consciousness was rapidly weakening under the repeated attacks, putting it on the verge of shattering. Humph! Vin Rambis increased the force of the mind storm once again, feeling satisfied that Audrey's entire island was shaking. This meant that he was about to completely control her. At this moment, he heard an ancient word, fate. In the real world, Vin Rambis looked up in surprise. All he saw was that Audrey's green eyes were dyed with the brightest, the most dazzling gold. Chapter 1050, Good at Using Hypnosis. As the ancient Hermes' words resounded, the areas where Audrey and Vin Rambis stood dimmed. It was as if someone had passed by, blocking the window that was closest to them, then quickly left. By the time the light returned, the island filled with a terrifying mind storm in the illusory world had transformed from Audrey's to Vin Rambis's. The person that had intruded on the other party's body of heart and mind went from Vin Rambis to Audrey. Fate Siphon Charm. This was made using a worm of time as the material. Using the Fool's powers, this charm was created. It could siphon off a corresponding target's subsequent fate for a short period of time, exchanging the corresponding fate with the user. It was the consultation fee Audrey had received from Gehrman Sparrow after she treated Hazel's mental breakdown. With the corresponding charm, she could divert her future of having her consciousness defenses broken and losing control over her thoughts to Vin Rambis. She then siphoned off the mind storm from him and opened her target's door to the body of heart and mind. She then directly altered and planted the corresponding consciousness's fate. In an instant, the situation reversed. Audrey went from the edge of collapse to gaining the absolute advantage. Of course, this advantage could only last for a short period of time. Frankly speaking, if it weren't for her imagining how she could save herself in a desperate situation, Audrey definitely wouldn't have thought of using the Fate Siphon charm. Or it could be said that, by the time she thought of it, it would be too late. At this moment, just like how she had practiced it countless times in her mind, she suppressed her surprised emotions from the effects of the Fate Siphon charm and quickly confirmed her condition. With her current advantage, she made the hypnosis and mind storm swirl together, instantly opening Vin Rambis's door to his body of heart and mind. Vin Rambis was instantly dumbfounded, as if he was an ordinary person whose attention had been diverted to Audrey's golden eyes and thus fall under her hypnosis. Yes, at this moment, as a demigod of the Spectator pathway, he had been controlled by Audrey, who was only a sequence 6. This way, even if the effects of the Fate Siphon charm came to an end, it wouldn't change the development in the real world. However, Audrey knew that, with the help of the magical charm, she was using Vin Rambis's powers to open the door to his body of heart and mind and achieve initial control. Whatever she wanted to do later would definitely be rejected by him, and with her sequence level, she had no means to resist or control such intense power. Furthermore, she could clearly sense that Vin Rambis was subconsciously resisting his current state. In the real world, a small amount of gray scales began to appear on his face. In no time, he would be able to forcefully extricate himself from the state of my initial control over his mind. A realization flashed across Audrey's mind. She then cast her gaze towards Vin Rambis's head, feeling a little regretful that she didn't carry a powerful revolver with her. Otherwise, she could take this opportunity to shoot at him several times in a row in an attempt to kill him. Soon, she recalled that she had dragon scales. She believed that Vin Rambis definitely had it, and that it was even stronger. It wasn't something an ordinary attack could tear through, even most mystical items that were at the mid or low sequences couldn't do so. And if she couldn't kill him in one shot, Vin Rambis would definitely be able to use this opportunity to regain consciousness and escape her control. Without any hesitation, Audrey, who lacked the appropriate offensive abilities, quickly came to a decision: hypnotize him. He's best at hypnotizing and is very resistant against this, so he wouldn't prepare any additional items that can affect his defense. I can't let him do things that will be against his will. With our difference in levels, I definitely can't resist the corresponding subconscious resistance he puts up. Thoughts ran through Audrey's mind as she spread her slightly parched lips. She tried hard not to show any signs of abnormality as she looked into Vin Rambis's eyes and said in a gentle voice, "Find a spot inside Glaine's mansion and wait. Find me in the garden 15 minutes later." Such a subconscious thought didn't stir any obvious signs of being rejected, therefore, Audrey was able to complete her control rather smoothly. To Vin Rambis, he was indeed looking for Audrey today, and the venue for the meeting was also Viscount Glaine's mansion. Audrey's hypnosis was simply changing the corresponding time and place, and the discrepancies were just in a very small aspect. It matched Vin Rambis's thoughts and didn't waste too much of his effort, therefore, she didn't encounter any intense resistance. "All right." Vin Rambis responded to Audrey's words. Audrey didn't care to let out a sigh of relief. She focused and continued looking into the other party's eyes. She gently said, "You will only come looking for me in 15 minutes, so you haven't seen me today. Since you haven't seen me, everything that happened just now definitely didn't happen. They will be forgotten." As Vin Rambis had accepted the hypnosis, he followed the logical train of thought. Although there was resistance, it wasn't anything intense. Soon, the golden light disappeared from those alluring eyes. "Yes, I haven't seen you before. Nothing happened just now." Vin Rambis repeated with a blank expression. The grayish-white scales on the surface of his skin had increased significantly again. After completing this crucial step, Audrey resisted the urge to pat her chest and thought for a second. When you hear my singing, it will become quiet. She wanted to hypnotize him with her charm, but she realized that she wasn't able to take on a seductive pose, and she couldn't make the corresponding expressions. She could only lift her hand to comb her blonde hair and tilt her head. The ripples in her eyes swirled as her smile beamed. Following that, she hummed a melody, Manor Under the Moon, in a nasal voice. Vin Rambis looked at the girl in front of him, who looked as beautiful as sunlight, flowers, and gems. Listening to the ethereal voice, his mind gradually turned silent, as he no longer had any resistance. Seeing that her initial control was about to be released, Audrey didn't hesitate and pointed to the other side of the corridor. Go over there, and you will regain consciousness and dispel dragon scales when you see the stained glass. She knew very well that on the other side of the corridor, there were exquisite white stained glass. This order didn't pose any danger, nor did it violate Vin Rambis's will. He immediately took a step forward, walked down the corridor, and turned right. Only when his back disappeared from her sights did Audrey slowly exhale, allowing the fear, alarm, and anxiety to surge into her heart. Her body trembled slightly as she opened her mouth slightly. She couldn't help but gasp and exhale. 10 seconds later, Audrey used placate on herself and calmed herself down. Then, she glanced at the wall clock and stood there, raising her hands and placing them in front of her mouth and nose, reciting Mr. Fool's honorific name in a low voice. She prayed for an angelic blessing again and requested this great existence to tell the world Gehrman Sparrow that she had confirmed when Vin Rambis would arrive and would summon him 2 minutes ahead of time, allowing him to arrive at the appropriate moment. There was no need to be in a rush or to be too close to prevent Vin Rambis from being aware of an ambush. During this process, Audrey only briefly mentioned what had happened. She didn't elaborate on it to prevent wasting any time. Following that, she raised her hands and pressed her cheeks, completely restoring her expression to normal. She began hypnotizing herself, allowing herself to sing the melody the moment she saw Vin Rambis. After doing all of this, Audrey went to the main hall and first found the golden retriever, Susie. She then retrieved the lie necklace and the alcohol nemesis diamond brooch. The latter, which could resist any mental influence, could only be worn for half an hour, otherwise, the damage one's liver and brain suffered would be irreversible. Therefore, Audrey prepared to wear them again after she left Glaine's residence to prevent Vin Rambis from finding her midway. Susie didn't notice anything amiss with Audrey as she watched her wear the brooch and necklace. After a few minutes, Audrey folded a black fishnet glove into her equestrian pocket and used the excuse of going to the washroom, making a detour to Viscount Glaine's garden. Then, she looked at the large clock hung up on the attached tower, her mind tensing up as she memorized the time. To her, she was afraid that Vin Rambis wouldn't come, but she was also worried that he might come early or be late. Time passed by slowly and Audrey used placate twice to calm herself down. When there was still 2 minutes and 15 seconds left, she took off the feather accessory on her hat and flicked her wrist. The scarlet flame soared, igniting the white feather. This was Lie's flame controlling ability. As the flames burned, they turned pale. In just 2 or 3 seconds, the feather, which was a product of artificial death, was reduced to ashes. Nothing happened around her. Looking at the clock, Audrey took out a charm made of tin and recited a word in ancient Hermes, lightning. The charm lit up as though many tiny electric snakes were entangling with it. It was a charm that summoned Gehrman Sparrow. When the lightning dissipated, the charm completely disintegrated and melted into the void. However, there was still silence without so much as a sound. Shio and Force should have found a church of Evernight Cathedral and begun praying. Audrey calmed down and pretended to enjoy the flowers of the remaining autumn days. She didn't lift her head to look at the large clock, counting the time in her heart. 3, 2, 1. She slowly raised her head and looked around, but she didn't see Vin Rambis. He discovered something strange and distanced himself from this place? Audrey's heart tightened as she couldn't help but think back to what she had missed. At that moment, she heard a gentle voice, "What are you looking for?" Audrey's pupils dilated. From the corner of her eye, she realized that the silver-haired, blue-eyed Vin Rambis had appeared beside her at some point in time, a hint of suspicion hidden in his voice. Having already hypnotized herself, she didn't hesitate at all. She followed her subconscious and started humming the melodic manner Under the Moon. Amidst the ethereal voice, Vin Rambis calmed down and listened attentively. Suddenly, he realized that the distance between him and Audrey had become very far despite them remaining in their respective spots. The dark night enveloped the garden despite it being late in the afternoon. A huge crimson moon rose over the top of the building as a figure stood there, wearing a black trench coat and a half-top hat. His face looked hazy due to the backlighting.
If you are enjoying this audiobook and would like to support Wispy Tales, please visit our Patreon and join our Discord server.